Good evening, everyone. I hope you find yourself in a moment of stillness because what we are about to walk through together is anything but still. Picture this: a young military leader standing at the center of a continental awakening that has been building for generations. Every whisper of independence that once drifted quietly through the Sahel has now converged into a roar. And at the heart of that storm stands Captain Ibrahim Traoré, holding a vision that cuts sharper than any weapon the old powers ever pointed at Africa. For months, African news networks have been tracking something extraordinary. Western intelligence agencies have been filing reports that grow thicker by the week. And in the marble halls of Brussels and Washington, strategists are beginning to ask a question they never thought they would have to answer. What happens when a small landlocked nation refuses to play by rules written in distant capitals? Burkina Faso is not a giant. It commands no oceans. It builds no skyscrapers that pierce clouds. But history has a way of choosing unlikely places to stage its most defining battles. And what is unfolding right now in the heart of West Africa feels like one of those turning points. The kind that will be studied in war colleges and debated in policy rooms long after the dust settles and the smoke clears. So before we step into the fire together, let me be clear about what you are about to witness. If you want to see beyond the headlines, if you want to understand how a captain in his 30s rewired the geopolitics of an entire region, then stay with this channel, because the winds are rising, and the next gust may redraw the map of West Africa forever. Here is the question that opens our journey tonight. Is Ibrahim Traoré building a new dawn for Burkina Faso, or is he walking straight into a trap designed by powers who have been setting snares across Africa for centuries? The story does not begin with a coup. It begins with a crack that spreads slowly across the Sahel, like a fault line running through ancient stone. For years, Burkina Faso sat at a crossroads, where insurgency spilled over from Mali, where foreign military bases multiplied like weeds, and where ordinary people felt abandoned by governments that promised security but delivered only occupation. When Traoré stepped into power, he did not inherit a stable nation. He walked into a house already burning, already shaking at its foundation, already filled with smoke. And from that first moment, he made a choice that would change everything. His first move was to sever military dependence on France. Not gradually, not diplomatically, but with a single decisive stroke that sent shockwaves from Ouagadougou to the Élysée Palace. French bases were closed. Security agreements that had shaped Sahel policy for 2 decades were torn up like old contracts that no longer served their purpose. Western media called it reckless. Local supporters called it liberation. African news outlets called it historic. And in the villages where French troops had once patrolled with impunity, people spoke a word they had not dared to speak in years: sovereignty. Meanwhile, NATO forces were quietly repositioning. Troops stationed across Ghana, Senegal, Niger, and Côte d'Ivoire were reclassified from counterterrorism units to strategic monitoring forces. The language used in public statements spoke of cooperation. The language used in classified briefings spoke of containment. It became clear to anyone reading the deeper signals that Burkina Faso had moved from a marginal concern to a central point of geopolitical interest. The question in Brussels and Washington was no longer whether Traoré would pivot away from Western influence. It was how far he intended to go, and who would stand beside him when the pressure came. Then came the move that changed the entire equation. Burkina Faso initiated direct security coordination with Mali and Niger, both led by military governments, equally frustrated with Western approaches to Sahel insurgency. Together, these 3 nations created something the world had not seen in decades: a unified front built on African priorities rather than external mandates. The West called it destabilizing. Many Africans called it overdue. And in the northern villages of Burkina Faso, where insurgent groups had operated freely for years, the shift felt immediate and undeniable. Local defense units began receiving new training. The chain of command tightened. National radio broadcasts reached citizens in more and full fold, speaking to them not as subjects, but as partners in collective defense. For older generations, it stirred memories of Sankara and the spirit of self-determination. For younger generations, it was an invitation to step into history rather than inherit it passively. But every move carried risk. The departure of French forces created a vacuum in intelligence capabilities. Cutting ties with longtime partners disrupted procurement lines and border monitoring systems. And behind every public decision, NATO analysts calculated the thresholds at which diplomatic pressure would transform into something far more dangerous. One American defense official, speaking anonymously to Africa news sources, described the situation with brutal clarity. Burkina Faso has decided to test how far it can pull away before someone tries to pull it back. As well came Departure, and then came the move that truly shifted the center of gravity. Russian military advisors arrived, not in shadowed secrecy, but through open cooperation agreements. Training centers expanded. Arms shipments increased. Intelligence sharing began weaving into Burkina Faso's defensive architecture. But Russia's entry was not ideological. It was transactional. Moscow saw an opportunity to expand influence in a region where Western dominance had gone unchallenged for generations. Traoré understood this perfectly. He engaged them on his own terms, carefully, pragmatically, without illusion. In Washington, the concern was less about Russian personnel and more about the trend itself. If Burkina Faso strengthened its independence, how many others might follow? Analysts began pointing to what some American strategists now call the Sahel sovereignty belt. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, forming a geopolitical message that echoed far beyond the desert. France reacted with barely concealed alarm. Years of influence were slipping away, and the loss of Burkina Faso threatened access to gold, manganese, and strategic minerals that Europe desperately needed. French officials privately described Traoré's government as unreliable and susceptible to Russian manipulation. Yet on the ground, the narrative was entirely different. Young Burkinabe rallied behind Traoré, painting murals, waving flags, and rewriting the national conversation about what independence could actually mean. ECOWAS found itself trapped between two gravitational forces. On one side were member states dependent on European development funds and security partnerships. On the other were nations that saw ECOWAS as compromised, too aligned with Western priorities to act independently. The bloc issued sharp warnings to Traoré, threatening sanctions and interventions. His response was immediate and defiant. Any ECOWAS military intervention would be treated as a declaration of war. The message was not hidden in diplomatic language. It was plain, steady, and unmistakable. Inside Burkina Faso, the transformation has seeped into daily life. For many young people, Traoré represents something they have never seen. A leader close to their age who speaks their languages and shares their frustrations. His speeches circulate through smartphones and radios, bypassing traditional media filters entirely. But not everyone sees the changes with optimism. Older generations remember the turbulence of past decades, the coups, the fragile institutions that rose only to fall. They admire Traoré's courage, but fear the consequences. They know how global powers respond when challenged. Economically, the consequences are already visible. Aid packages have slowed. Development projects tied to European institutions are being reassessed. Burkina Faso's decision to renegotiate mining contracts and reclaim control over its gold wealth is popular domestically, but it creates ripples that reach far beyond the Sahel. Local markets reflect the tension. Prices fluctuate unpredictably. Transport routes once guarded by foreign troops now rely on newly trained local units. Small businesses hope long-term sovereignty will outweigh short-term disruption. Socially, something profound is happening. Civilian defense networks are being formalized. Youth groups volunteer to patrol vulnerable areas. For supporters, this marks the rise of a self-reliant Burkina Faso. For critics, it represents militarization at a dangerous pace. There is pride, yes, but also fear. Fear that the burden of defending the nation may fall too heavily on shoulders not yet ready to bear it. From Washington's perspective, Traoré is not simply a regional concern. He is a geopolitical tremor with the potential to shift long-term strategic assumptions. American policy in the Sahel has rested on four pillars: counterterrorism, regional stability, access to minerals, and alliances with Western-aligned governments. Burkina Faso just pulled itself out of that framework entirely. European leaders, especially in France, feel the pressure more acutely. Mineral access is tightening. Influence is slipping. And the Burkina Faso-Mali-Niger axis threatens the architecture Paris has relied on for decades. Russia views the situation pragmatically. Moscow does not need Burkina Faso to become a full ally. It only needs the country to reduce Western influence enough to open lanes for Russian partnerships. Every inch the West loses is an inch Russia gains without heavy investment. China maintains a calmer posture, watching closely but waiting to see whether the new Sahel coalition stabilizes or fractures before committing resources. What unifies all global perspectives is recognition that the Sahel is no longer peripheral. It is central, a corridor of minerals, migration routes, insurgent networks, and geopolitical competition. And Burkina Faso, under Traoré, has placed itself at the very center of the map. The path ahead is not a straight road. It is a narrow ridge carved between deep valleys. Over the next 6 to 12 months, three forces will determine Burkina Faso's trajectory. First is the strength of the Sahel alliance. If Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso maintain unity and coordinate intelligence sharing, the balance of power in West Africa will shift in ways not seen since the Cold War. Second is economic adaptation. If Burkina Faso directs mining revenues into infrastructure and defense, Traoré's revolution will gain deeper roots. But if trade disruptions intensify or inflation rises, ordinary citizens may bear the cost of geopolitical ambition. Third is insurgency pressure. Extremist groups thrive in transitions, and they will test Burkina Faso's defenses relentlessly. The success of newly trained local units will determine whether the nation holds its ground or whether instability erodes confidence from within. Still, there is an undeniable sense that history is bending. For many in Burkina Faso, this is the first time in decades they feel they are writing their own chapter rather than inheriting someone else's script. If you want to follow this blaze as it rises, if you want to witness how one of Africa's youngest leaders challenges the old world's architecture, stay with this channel. We walk into the smoke together, not away from it. So I leave you with the question that will define the months ahead. Is Ibrahim Traoré rewriting the fate of Burkina Faso, or is he stepping into a cycle written long before he ever held power? The next spark is coming.